Hello, class. So now we are moving into the second part of Locke's second treatise. We've seen in the first part how he gives us an account of the state of nature, which is very different from that of Hobbes, because he maintains that within the state of nature itself, there is a certain kind of commodious and harmonious living amongst men because they're endowed with a kind of natural reason that allows them to reciprocally recognize the rights of other individuals, right? Nonetheless, he says that there are certain inconveniences that do arise in this more or less harmonious state of nature. And in order to address those inconveniences, there is, in fact, a need for the multitude of the state of nature to come together and form a society and a state, right? So that's the reasoning, and we'll see how that argument is made. So now reading from the 7th chapter of Political Society, this is page 323, he says, man being born, as has been proved, with a title to perfect freedom, this is perfect freedom in the state of nature, and an uncontrolled enjoyment of all the rights and privileges of the law of nature, equally with any other man or number of men in the world, had by nature a power not only to preserve his property, that is his life, liberty, and estate, against the injuries and attempts of another man, but to judge of and punish the breaches of the law in others, as he is persuaded the offenses deserves, even with death itself, if crimes were heinous, in crimes where the heinousness of the fact, in his opinion, requires it. So in the state of nature, you're obviously entitled to your own property, that is your life, liberty, and your possessions. But if somebody tries to attack you, attack your rights, undermine your rights, then you also have the right to punish them. This is what he calls the executive right in the state of nature. You can punish them even with death if you think that the outrage they've committed against you is so severe, right? But this, he says, opens the door to a kind of state of nature, a state of war, of all against all, because no one can be really the judge in that kind of situation where there's a dispute between two people in the state of nature. Because if there's been some harm committed against you, you're going to be partial to your case, and the person who's committing the crime would obviously be partial to their case, right? So it's impossible to judge that kind of situation, and hence there is a need for some kind of superior authority. So he says, but because no political society can be nor subsist without having in itself the power to preserve the property, and in order thereon to punish the offenses of all those of that society, there and there only is political society. Okay. Now, the important thing is that he's talking about political society and not the state or government. Okay. Now, this is an important issue. But the thing is that for Locke, there's an agreement that people in the state of nature come to. It's similar to what Hobbes calls a social covenant. He calls it the social contract or social compact. And it's an agreement in order to form a common community, right? To form a civil or political society. That's the notion he uses. So he says on page 325, wherever, therefore, any number of men are so united into one society, as to quit everyone his executive power of the law of nature. So the agreement is that we all give up our right to our executive power in the state of nature, which is the right to punish whoever commits a crime or offense against us, right? So we give up that right in order to create and form a society in agreement with each other, and to resign it to the public. There and there only is a political or civil society, right? So the claim is that in order to protect your property and remove the inconveniences you face in the state of nature, you're going to give up your executive right to punish anybody who commits a crime against you or offense against you. And you come to the conclusion that it is better to have the advantages of civil society. Now, this society is constituted by a majority. This is, again, a crucial part of the argument, which is not the same as that of Hobbes. This is chapter 8 now, of the beginnings of political society. In this chapter, this is a complex chapter because he's in fact trying to make the case that the state of nature is a historical fact, and that there is a certain kind of historical stage model. First, people enter into society through family, then a certain kind of estate, and then they arrive at a political society. So he's actually making the case that there is a history to this. For Hobbes, this was purely a hypothetical situation. And we're not going to discuss this because it's a complex and very controversial matter. But nonetheless, the key issue for us is that he says here that again, what we're agreeing to, what the social contract is leading to, is the establishment of a community. So he says, when any number of men have so consented to make one community or government, they have thereby presently incorporated and make one body politic, wherein the majority have a right to act and conclude the rest. Right? The majority have the right, but they constitute a body politic. This again is an important difference with Hobbes, because for Hobbes, the social contract leads to the establishment of a common sovereign power, and the sovereign power, it is in the body of the sovereign power that the political community exists. For Locke, the political community is primary, right? So the political community is primary, and only then can they authorize a state. Right? So the state, the sovereign, is not essential to the unity of the political community. In fact, if the political community dislikes the state, this is going to be a crucial argument again, they can dissolve the state. They can dissolve the state. So the society and the unity of the people, the community, is something that is prior to the state. Okay. So this raises the question now, what is the end? What is the ultimate goal of this? The purpose of having this community and then establishing a state is, he says, preservation of property. Okay. So this is chapter 9 of the ends of political society. He says, the great and chief end, therefore, of men's uniting into commonwealths and putting themselves under government is the preservation of their property, to which, in the state of nature, there are many things wanting. Okay? Because the preservation of property in society under the rule of a state is better preserved. Why? Because first, there wants an established, settled, known law, received and allowed by common consent, to be the standard of right and wrong, and the common measure to decide all controversies between them. Because when you have a political society and a state, then you can establish universal and generally applied laws that are true for everyone, and that demarcate clearly what violations are, what someone's rights are, and that these are known by everybody in that community. Okay, but this has to be by common consent. It has to be by common consent. Secondly, in the state of nature, there wants a known and indifferent judge. Okay, so whenever there are disputes between two people inside society, there is always somebody to arbitrate who's not one of those two persons. They can be neutral at arbitration and establishing and making sure that the laws that are established are actually applied with uniformity and impartiality. Right? That's crucial. And thirdly, in a state of nature, there often wants power to back the support the sentence when the right and to give it due execution. Again, the claim is that if you're gonna pass a judgment or pass a law and you want to enforce it, you need some kind of common power and authority in order to back that up. You need to be able to employ it by force. Otherwise, people would be tempted to violate it. Right? So this is again similar to Hobbes. The argument is that since I'm giving up, I'm transferring my executive power under natural law, that is the power to punish whoever commits an offense against me, I'm agreeing along with everybody else in the political society to give up that right and to transfer that right onto the state, onto the Commonwealth. Okay. So now the only key difference with Hobbes, in some sense, the role of the state, as Locke understands it, is similar. But the key difference is that one would only do this. One would only do this if this is better than the state of nature. Okay. For Hobbes, authorizing a state is a necessary thing because it allows you to escape the condition of war of all against all. Right? Since the war of all against all is only an exception in Locke's worldview, because in state of nature you can have enduring peace and harmony, it's only to deal with this exceptional possibility of a war of all against all. So it is within our natural reason to evaluate whether or not it is a necessity, right? We can evaluate whether or not we are entering a situation of war of all against all. So it is not a desperate necessity. Coming into agreeing, establishing a social contract that constitutes a society and then establish a state, it is only done if, according to our natural reason, we arrive at the conclusion that it will improve our conditions of life. It will secure and stabilize our property, right? So it will actually help us live the life we live in a state of nature, but with a greater degree of security. So it always involves, in Locke's view, we human beings are, because of our natural reason, we have this kind of questioning capacity. He says on page 353, but though men, when they enter into society, give up the equality, liberty, and executive power they had in the state of nature into the hands of society, to be so far disposed of by the legislative as the good of the society shall require, yet it being given only with the intention in everyone the better to preserve himself, his liberty and property. And in the parenthesis, this is the key part, for no rational creature can be supposed to change his condition with an intention to be worse, right? The power of the society or legislative constituted by them can never be supposed to extend farther than the common good. Okay? So if you are a rational being, you're always going to examine whether or not entering into society, that is becoming a part of the social contract, establishing a civil society, and then transferring your rights onto a common power, a state that will govern you, you will only do that if that markedly improves your life from the state of nature. Okay. Now, this again raises the important question: what kind of government is Locke actually advocating for? This again is a slightly complex argument. He's not all out in favor of a democracy necessarily. So there is a difference between the form of government and the very reason for the state or the government to exist. This is now chapter 10. He says, the majority having, as has been showed, upon men's first uniting into society, the whole power of the community, naturally in them, may employ all that power in making laws for the community from time to time, and executing those laws by officers of their own appointing. And then the form of government is a perfect democracy. Okay, so democracy is a possibility, and it's a possibility in the same sense as it is for Hobbes, that is, the majority rule, make the laws and also execute the laws. Or else, they may put the powers of making laws into the hands of a few select men and their heirs and successors. Then it is an oligarchy. Or else into the hands of one man, and then it is a monarchy. And so, skipping over, so accordingly, of these, the community may make compounded and mixed forms of government as they think good. Okay, so even a republic that is a mixed constitution that will draw elements from all three pure types of regimes is also a possibility. But the key issue is that the form of the government, whether it's a democracy, a oligarchy, a monarchy, or a republic, ultimately requires the consent of the whole community. Okay, so he says in the next passage of this chapter, by commonwealth, I must be understood all along to mean not a democracy or any form of government. Okay, so the commonwealth state is something that is not, it doesn't say anything about its form, democracy, monarchy, oligarchy, or republic. It simply says it's an independent community, or civitas, right? That's the language, civitas, which is that it is a society of men agreed through and come into being through a social contract. Okay, so the state, the nature of the state depends again on what the people in that community consent to. However, there is an important caveat, and the caveat is that he argues for the separation of the legislative power and the executive power. This follows to some extent from the argument he's been making, which is that ultimately society and the state, insofar as they establish common rules and common laws that are universal and generally applied, it is imperative that the law-making authorities in any kind of society have supreme power. Okay. So he makes the claim, this is chapter 12 now, of legislative, executive, and federative power. The legislative power is that which has the right to direct how the force of the Commonwealth shall be employed for preserving the community and the members of it. Okay. So it is the legislative power ultimately that decides how to attain the public good, public safety. But because the laws that are at once and in a short time made have a constant and lasting force and in need of perpetual execution or tendence thereunto, therefore it's necessary that there should also be a power always in being which should see to the execution of the laws that are made and remain in force. And thus legislative and executive power come often to be separated. Okay, so there is a need to separate out legislative power and executive power. Now, it is entirely possible if a political community wants to have an elective monarchy or or even a hereditary monarchy, that is, if they consent to have that kind of form of government, that the executive power and the legislative power will be combined in one. Okay, but analytically, and depending on the form of government, there might be a separation between the legislative power and the executive power. But the key point is that the legislative power is the supreme power. Okay, that there is a legislative supremacy. Why is this? Because again, you need laws that are generally understood by everyone, and these are known laws, but they're also universal. Okay, they're universal, and this is what allows you to defend the society against the arbitrariness of one person. Okay, if the laws are general and universal, that means it applies for everyone equally. Okay, it applies for all the members of that political community equally. It's not going to privilege one group or one person specifically. That would be arbitrariness, right? That would be arbitrariness, and that's something that he wants to avoid. And hence it is essential for there to be legislative supremacy. So the claim is this time from page 367. He says, in all cases, whilst the government subsists, the legislative is the supreme power. For what can give laws to another must need be superior to him. And since the legislative is no otherwise legislative of the society, but by the right it has to make laws for all parts and for every member of the society, prescribing rules to their action and giving power of execution where they are transgressed, the legislative must needs to be supreme. And all other powers in any members or parts of that society must be derived from and subordinate to it. That is, the lawmaking institution itself has to tell you what the rules and procedures are for selecting the executive power and how they must themselves execute the laws. Right? So everything is governed by universal, generally known laws. This is crucial. So what it does is that it allows a check on executive power and arbitrariness. So the whole normative political project of Locke is to argue against tyranny. Right? It is to argue against absolute power of one person, a monarch, right? Because the tyrannical government is one where the consent of the majority is violated. Okay, and more importantly, tyranny is something that is worse than the state of nature. It is worse than the state of nature, and he makes a very compelling case for this. He says, for wherever any two men are, this is from chapter 7, for wherever any two men are who have no standing rule and common judge to appeal on earth for the determination of controversies of right betwixt them, there they are still in a state of nature, under all the inconveniences of it, with only this woeful difference to the subject or rather slave of an absolute prince. So in a state of nature, you face certain inconveniences, but there's still a difference, and it's a woeful difference, if you are a slave or a subject to an absolute power. Why? That whereas in the ordinary state of nature, you have the liberty to judge your own right, and according to the best of your power, to maintain it. That is, if somebody constitutes an offense to you, you still have the executive right to punish them as you see fit. Right? Now, when whenever his property is invaded by the will and order of this monarch. But if you're living under a tyrannical regime, an absolute sovereign power, and the will and the order of the sovereign does harm to you, that is, it invades your property, then he has not only no appeal, as those in society ought to have, but as if he were degraded from the common state of rational creatures, is denied a liberty to judge of or to defend his right, and so is exposed to all the misery and inconveniences that man can fear from one, who being in the unrestrained state of nature is yet corrupted with flattery and armed with power. Okay, because when there's a dispute between you and the sovereign, then the sovereign is going to be partial to their own interests and needs. So if they violate your property, then clearly there's nobody to judge neutrally between the offense and the dispute between you. So if you are living under an absolute tyrannical regime, you are worse off. You are worse off than you are in the state of nature. Why? Because an absolute power, a tyrannical regime, is arbitrary. It does not give you justifications. It does not operate according to general applicable universal laws. Okay. So the argument is that when you find yourself in tyranny, you can return to a state of nature. You can return to a state of nature. This is something that this is the argument he makes in the last chapter. Reading now from page 412. The reason why men enter into society is the preservation of their property, and the end why they choose and authorize a legislative is that there may be laws made and rules set as guards and fences to the properties of all members of the society to limit the power and moderate the dominion of every part and member of the society. Okay, this is in some sense a small, succinct sentence to sum up the whole argument. For since it can never be supposed to be the will of the society that the legislative should have a power to destroy that which everyone designs to secure by entering into society, and for which the people submitted themselves to the legislator of their own making, whenever the legislators endeavor to take away and destroy the property of the people, that is, the legislative or the state in general, tries to do something that is contrary to the very reason it exists, the very reason why it was authorized into existence, or reduce them to slavery, reduce the subjects and the members of the society to slavery under arbitrary power, they put themselves in a state of war with the people. Okay, they put themselves in a state of war with the people, who are thereupon absolved of any further obedience. So this is again contra Hobbes, right? In Hobbes, even if your life is being protected, then you still, in some sense, try to examine whether or not your life is under threat or not. And only if your life is under threat, only if your self-preservation is under threat, can you choose to not be obedient to the absolute power. Under all other conditions, you must obey. You not only must obey, you must worship the sovereign power. But here he says, not only your life, if your liberty is trampled upon, that is, you become a slave under arbitrary power, or your property, your possessions are attacked by the state, then you are absolved from any further obedience and left to common refuge, which God had provided for all men against force and violence. Okay. So if the state does something that is contrary to the reason for its existence, that is, it tries to attack your property, eliminate the very reason for, undermine the very reason for its own existence, then you have entered into a state of nature with a state of war with the state. Okay, you have entered into a state of war with the Commonwealth. Okay, what does this lead to? It leads to a right to revolution. This is from page 419. Whosoever uses a force without right, that is, force without law, straight up violence, as everyone does in society, who does it without law, puts himself into a state of war with those against whom he uses it. And in that state, all former ties are cancelled, all other rights cease, and everyone has a right to defend himself and to resist the aggressor. So you have a right to resist the aggressor. And resistance, he will say, also involves rebellion or revolution. So if the state becomes tyrannical, you have the right to revolt against it. Okay. Now, just to sum up, again, this is a relatively short video because we covered bulk of the underlying argument in the first part, is that you have the right to revolt against a tyrannical state, which means that Locke is able to introduce a test for assessing government's legitimacy. Okay, so it makes sovereign power subject to constant scrutiny and examination, because ultimately the source of the power is the society, and the society can choose when to dissolve the state. Whenever the state or the government does something that is contrary to the interests and the reason for the state's existence, then the community, which is again prior to the state, can decide to no longer operate according to its authority, no longer subject itself to the authority of the state, and dissolve it. Right? So the government has to protect the rights as they are, and if they cannot, then they must be dissolved. Okay, so and how do they do this? By withdrawing their consent. That is, in order to dissolve the government, you have to no longer give them authorization. You have to withdraw your consent, and then through a new kind of agreement, establish a different kind of regime or state. So this is Locke's whole argument. Again, there's obviously much more to discuss, more complexities overall in the argument. But what Locke opens the door to is to think about politics where the power, the ultimate power, resides with a political community, and any kind of political regime or state has to be governed through the complete consent of the political community, of the majority. And if the state does something that is contrary to the interests and concerns of the majority, then that state can be dissolved. Okay? So there's the whole framework now for assessing the legitimacy of the state. This is, in some sense, the normative thrust of Locke's political philosophy.